One Punch Man is a story about the futility of heroism in a world abandoned by God. Their society is facing an impending apocalypse where, no matter how hard they work, everything seems to be getting worse with no end in sight. People keep turning into monsters due to their growing obsessions, cities are destroyed every other week because of the constant attacks, and, most worrying of all, many of the heroes who are supposed to be stopping this care more about sabotaging each other than about fixing the actual problem. In such a bleak reality, it almost seems pointless to be a hero. After all, why try if it won't make a difference? And yet, one man stumbled upon the solution to this without even seeking it, becoming so powerful he could save the world with a single punch. What could possibly motivate him to be so strong? Was it a lust for money and glory, or a lofty ideal that pushed him this far? The answer, however, is none of the above. He only did it because it was fun.
なんだとこいつ本気か先生あなたという人はふざけないでください
Okay, Saitama isn't exactly what you'd expect from the average hero. The fact that he's more interested in amusing himself than in the world around him can make him seem uncaring, but I would argue this carries an important message that is often overlooked. It's ironic because, just like Saitama, One Punch Man itself is often misjudged due to how it looks on the surface. Many people either dismiss it simply for being a comedy, or they only care about superficial things like power scaling, which is doing it a huge disservice. The story actually comments on the hopelessness of our times with a surprisingly mature perspective, using action and humor to soften blows so the audience isn't immediately repelled by the subject matter. It's not a coincidence many of the villains are motivated by anxieties that plague society. The very first monster that appeared wanted to punish humanity for poisoning the earth, and he took his role very seriously, going on a self-righteous rant about the environment while he wiped out a city. Then Saitama appeared, claiming to be a hero for fun, which provoked the monster even more due to how flippant that sounded. And of course, we know how it ends. While funny in a vacuum, this scene is also justifying the story's value in a clever way. It immediately touched on a controversial topic like environmentalism and contrasted it with Saitama's philosophy to deliver its message. This might seem callous or selfish, making light of something people take seriously, but there's a deeper point being made here, and I'll get to it soon enough. Before I continue, I want to highlight the genius of this introductory scene a little more. You see, it's actually establishing the themes and structure that One Punch Man will follow for the rest of the series in the span of like 3 minutes. A monster attacks, the heroes get their asses kicked, Saitama appears with a nonchalant attitude, and the villain rants about how justified they are before dying in one hit. This is something a lot of great stories often do at the beginning. They set up a microcosm that shows what the narrative is going to be like from the start to prime the audience for what's ahead. That said, the best example of this comes up immediately afterwards, when we see Saitama's backstory. This is where the message of One Punch Man is put on full display. We're shown right off the bat that, before becoming a hero, Saitama was someone who kept being rejected at many job interviews despite repeatedly trying his best. The hopelessness he felt from being unemployed was enough to make him want to end his life, something that is far too common today. It's easy to gloss over how dark this is though, because the monster he fought was a silly man crab in his underwear. Saitama even brings up declining birth rates as his reason for protecting the kid. It works as a joke, since it's such a mundane excuse for risking his life, but it's also addressing a big issue that Japan has been struggling with for years now. Even the fact that the kid is ugly has meaning behind it. Saitama's decision to save him is a way of communicating that we shouldn't give up on the future, even if it looks unpleasant, all without sounding too ham-fisted about it. Through this, we can see the power of humor. It creates emotional distance between the audience and a difficult subject matter, while subtly commenting on what should be done about it. The trick here is that, by not taking itself too seriously, it comes more from a place of understanding rather than sanctimonious judgment, making its lesson feel a lot more genuine. And that's One Punch Man in a nutshell because, despite how goofy he can be, Saitama is always portrayed as an inspirational figure. A lot of people seem to get this wrong about parodies. It's not just about ridiculing a genre, but honoring it as well. This is accomplished by exaggerating the style and tropes of these stories, which can only be properly done if you're already familiar with them. That's why writers need to care about the meaning behind tropes in order to subvert them. When they don't, it comes across as pointless since it's not saying anything relevant about the subject. It's the difference between playful teasing and bullying. Friends can poke fun at each other because there's already a degree of familiarity between them, and the jokes are usually built on a grain of truth. But if a stranger starts mocking someone for no good reason, then they're just being an asshole. Parodies function the same way, and this story succeeds at being a great one with its very premise alone. The most fundamental aspect of a superhero story is that good triumphs over evil. It's always at the core of these narratives, even when it's being subverted in works like Watchmen or Avengers Infinity War. One Punch Man makes fun of this by taking it to its logical extreme, presenting Saitama as someone so overpowered that it's taken as a given he will never lose. This is a very common criticism of superhero stories, something that usually gets them called unrealistic, killing all the tension since the audience already knows the result. And yet, it still works here. Remember how I said the structure of the entire story is already laid out in the very first scene? This is why that's so important. It's very clearly telling you from the start that Saitama will always save the day. By making fun of the idea that heroes are always victorious, while at the same time using this trope as the backbone of the story, it's actually elevating the concept of heroism and not dismissing it. A very common sentiment shared nowadays is that heroes aren't real. Some people even resent the very idea of them. After all, why should anyone worry about important issues if someone will always come along to fix it in the end? Doesn't that just breed complacency? And they're right, to a certain extent, but I also feel this is a huge misunderstanding over the concept of heroism. You see, a hero isn't someone that solves all your problems. Real heroes are those who, through their actions, inspire you to be a better person. This is an idea that goes all the way back to Greek mythology, and probably even farther than that. Heroes like Achilles and Odysseus were never portrayed as perfect people that never made mistakes. Quite the opposite, actually. Their flaws usually made things worse for everyone around them. What made these heroes valuable were the lessons people could learn from their shortcomings, to show the folly of qualities like hubris or anger. One Punch Man carries the spirit of this at the heart of its narrative. It's both the biggest and most subtle message it contains. A good example is the Hero Association. It's heavily implied that it wouldn't exist if Saitama hadn't protected that kid in his backstory. By choosing to fight the crab monster, he inspired the kid's grandfather into developing its system where heroes could thrive, indirectly helping thousands of people without even realizing it. This is also why Moomin Rider is so valuable to the story. He loses all of his fights, and yet the influence he has on others is massive. Stinger, Lightning Max, and even an S-Class like Tank Top Master all learned from his example, focusing more on saving people than on defeating monsters after meeting him. His fight versus the Deep Sea King is all about emphasizing this point. Here we see a man that was hopelessly weak, facing an unstoppable opponent and only cared about strength. On the surface, it looked pointless to even try, but Moomin Rider did it anyway and wound up saving Genos in the process. That's something people always overlook about this moment. The Deep Sea King was seconds away from finishing off Genos before Moomin Rider intervened. If he hadn't stepped in, Genos would most certainly be dead. This is one of the few times where Saitama showing up isn't played for a laugh. He actually compliments Moomin Rider for his bravery, something we rarely see him do. Not even the S-ranks get that amount of respect from him. It's probably the most heartfelt moment in the entire story. This theme doesn't stop there. Genos' reverence for Saitama is founded on this very principle. He never expects Saitama to fix his problems. In fact, he often tries to solve everything on his own, even when he knows Saitama could easily handle it. This is because he sees him as a role model and not a personal savior. Their student-teacher relationship is usually treated like a joke, but whether intentionally or not, Saitama has actually taught him a lot about being a hero. Genos remarks on it at the end of the alien invasion, calling himself someone who was too eager to eliminate evil at the beginning of his journey. It was only after meeting his master that he developed a sense of humility, which stopped him from being so obsessed with revenge. One of the most memorable jokes we get from him even hints at this progression. Back when he introduced himself, the way he droned on about his backstory indicated that, like most 19-year-olds, he was too absorbed in his own personal narrative to notice the flaws of his mindset. Saitama, of course, points this out in his own special way. Genos then goes on to repeat this line on several occasions, showing he's already learning from his mistakes. More importantly though, we never really see him do this ever again. Yes, he still rambles a lot when talking about Saitama, but he also grows more interested in things outside his mission, as mentioned by Dr. Kusano, who notices he's not pursuing the mad cyborg as much anymore. There's also the fact that Genos is still undergoing Saitama's training, which is not in a conventional way. He's not doing normal exercises because he can't grow muscles, but that's not really what made Saitama so strong. His training was about pushing himself every day until his limber broke, and Genos has been doing this all along, fighting monsters that keep wrecking him only to come back stronger every time. His growth throughout the story has been immense, but it's even more impressive after taking into account that it's only been a few months since he became Saitama's disciple. That's a ridiculous amount of progress for such a short amount of time. The only reason it's not that noticeable is because he keeps comparing himself to Saitama, who breaks all sense of scale. This theme of heroism by encouraging self-improvement is also the essence of Saitama's entire character, and not just in the obvious sense where he worked out a lot to grow strong. It could be argued that, at the beginning of the series, Saitama wasn't really fulfilling the most important role of a hero. All he ever did before meeting Genos was show up and destroy every monster he faced, rarely connecting with anyone on a deeper level. Don't get me wrong, this was still valuable work, but, by his own admission, his actions weren't really making a difference. Stronger monsters kept appearing every day, cities were still being destroyed, and the one thing that gave Saitama meaning, the thrill of a challenge, had slowly faded away. His circumstances only begin to improve when he starts letting others into his life. It all started with Genos, who first made him aware of the Hero Association. Saitama didn't even want him around, but slowly warmed up to the idea until relying on him for support. This in turn opened the door for Saitama to meet other heroes and start inspiring them through his work. Because of this, without even realizing it, Saitama attracted a group of friends that ended up enriching his life. And now, thanks to them, he shows more emotion than before, the very thing he said he had lost. For example, although he claims he's not doing hero work for money or recognition, he's constantly envious of Genos' popularity and had no problem scamming him for rent. You could chalk this up to Saitama being a hypocrite, but I don't think it's that simple. Things like financial security or social acceptance are still necessary to have a good life. They only turn into a problem when valued above your own self-image. This is an important distinction to make because, at the end of the day, Saitama is still human. The point is that anyone can be like him if they tried, so the message would fall apart if he were too perfect. That's also why he's such a sore loser, as seen with Silverfang and King. Even hunting down a mosquito can annoy him. It's probably the most serious we ever see him in the story. All of this suggests his humanity never actually went away. The melancholy that haunted him came from social isolation, not his ridiculous strength. When we get a glimpse into his past, we see him being ostracized during his school years, and failing to get a normal job once he became an adult, meaning his alienation had been building up for a long time. That's why he isn't nearly as callous as he might seem at first glance. Usually he hears out his enemies and sympathizes with them, since he tends to understand where they're coming from. It's only when they act superior or justify their cruelty due to their struggles that he grows bored, like with Boros. That fight in particular is interesting because it shows everything I've been talking about. Right as Boros was starting to lose, he described Saitama as someone who makes him want to go all out, meaning even the villains are inspired by him. This leads to a common, yet important message, that connecting with others is far more important than power. I know what you might be thinking though. Boros only said that because of Saitama's overwhelming strength. Doesn't that mean his power is what actually matters? And yes, while that's partially correct, it also ignores the fact that achieving his level of strength didn't change his life in any meaningful way. That's the whole joke. He saves the world on a regular basis and he's still worried about getting a good deal at the supermarket. This isn't just a funny gag, it's also a nuanced statement on the nature of heroism. The reality is that doing the right thing will rarely make you popular. In fact, most of the time, it's pretty fucking lame. If it weren't, everyone would do it. But that's the thing about true heroes. They don't do good acts for the sake of things like fame or money. They do it because it comes from within. The inability to understand this is actually the biggest flaw of every antagonist in the series. Notice I'm saying antagonist and not villain or monster, because it also applies to the heroes who get in Saitama's way. From what we're shown, this mentality is far too common in their line of work. Saitama experienced it as soon as he joined the association. Snake, an A-class hero, literally ambushed him just because he didn't feel respected enough in their meeting. This could have been devastating to anyone other than Saitama, ruining their career before it even started. Afterwards, we see a lot of the tank top heroes behaving the same way. One of them even antagonized Saitama in front of the crowd with no provocation, just to gain more clout. Then, after Saitama passed him in the rankings, he went as far as smearing his reputation to make himself look better. What makes this infuriating is that it happened right after Saitama saved the city from a giant meteorite. You would think the public would appreciate the value of someone like him, especially when threats keep escalating every week, and yet, they're so focused on the superficial damage that they can't see the bigger picture. This outlook, ironically enough, turns these heroes into yet another existential threat. By sabotaging others, they're actually accelerating the downfall of society, which is at odds with their original purpose. How many more people could be saved if rising heroes weren't targeted by their peers? It's the type of behavior that makes you wonder if humanity is worth protecting in the first place. Monsters and villains are individuals who double down on this logic, turning evil due to their fixation with things outside themselves. It's subtle, but while they appear to have different motivations, they all actually share the same underlying attitude. Crablante turned into a monster for being obsessed with crabs, murdering anyone that made fun of his appearance. Beefcake the Giant also made the same mistake. He wanted to be recognized as the strongest man on the planet, but had no purpose for it beyond wanting the title. Once he realized this, he quickly felt empty inside. Even a brilliant mind like Dr. Genus was driven to villainy after feeling rejected by the world. Although he wound up uncovering the secret to eternal youth, that still wasn't good enough for him. The fact that nobody approved of his ideas when starting out left a massive chip on his shoulder, making him obsessed with proving his worth. If he had simply been happy with his accomplishment, he would have spared himself a lot of grief. Thankfully, he was smart enough to realize this after meeting Saitama, opening a shop with his infinite takoyaki technique. All of these characters allowed external qualities to define their self-image, which is exactly what led them down the wrong path. This theme is reiterated through every antagonist that shows up, culminating in the ultimate counterpart to Saitama, God. Deities have always been used across many different cultures to represent natural forces beyond our control. In other words, they're the literal embodiment of the universe. Since every antagonist in the story values the world's judgment over their own, they're carrying out God's will by allowing it to guide their choices, even when they're not aware of it. This isn't speculation either. It's literally Homeless Emperor's entire motivation. He came to the conclusion that the world is far more important than humanity itself, and it's exactly what put him in contact with God. The philosophical implications of this are staggering. Explaining it probably goes beyond my skills as a writer, but I'm trying to push my limits here, so fuck it. Let's go down the rabbit hole. First, it's important to understand that moral statements are inevitable in the superhero genre. Like I mentioned earlier, these stories work off the premise that good triumphs over evil, so by design, they always need to comment on the nature of morality. This can be accomplished either overtly or through subtext, and can't really be avoided, since even ignoring the issue implies that good and evil don't matter, which is still a moral statement. So what does this have to do with God? Everything. For the longest time, God was seen in the West as the ultimate source of moral authority. I know One Punch Man is a Japanese story, but the fact that it's inspired by the Western idea of superheroes, i.e. Caped Crusaders like Batman or Superman, means it's also inheriting some of the philosophical baggage that influenced this genre, namely the Jewish/Christian morality of its authors. The God shown in this story is obviously not the Abrahamic one, though. It actually feels more like a postmodern interpretation of an ultimate ruler of the cosmos. A nihilistic avatar of fate that is indifferent to the plight of living beings on Earth, choosing who should be strong and who should be weak by imposing limits on them. Instead of inspiring people, this entity lures in its victims with the promise of solving all their problems, the exact opposite of what heroes stand for in the story. Just like deities used to represent natural forces, this is a depiction of how humanity now feels about the universe at large. Overwhelming existential dread. It alludes to the fact that our suffering is inherently pointless, and that trying to change this is a waste of time, which calls into question the whole point of morality. It's like I said at the beginning, why bother being a good person if it won't make a difference? The world often feels like a cold, meaningless place that only seems to reward power-hungry monsters, and when compared to its scale, it's easy to think of human life as insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But of course, One Punch Man is all about challenging this notion. Unlike many other stories, Saitama didn't become a hero because he was chosen for it, or because he was born with a unique power. He just did it because he felt like it. It might sound too simple, but I find it incredibly profound. The problems that affect our society often can seem insurmountable, especially when there's nothing a single individual can do about them. It can even get to the point where they rob us of our happiness, since it can feel wrong to enjoy ourselves when there's so much going on in the world. But that's just not a healthy way to live. Saitama's decision to be a hero for fun is a way of fighting a cruel world that says he doesn't matter, giving himself the right to exist even if God itself opposed it. That's why dismissing this story for being a comedy, or obsessing with power scaling feels wrong to me. Obviously, its main objective is making us laugh, but by doing so, it's also telling us that we shouldn't give up on humanity, even if it seems foolish or self-serving. This act of self-invention is what makes Saitama so important, because In a world abandoned by God, the most heroic thing a person can do is create their own purpose. As you can see, this story means a lot to me. It actually played a big part in me wanting to be a writer. I've been following for almost a decade now, and Saitama just keeps being more inspiring the older I grow. I'm broke, always looking for a good deal at the supermarket, and losing more hair every time I shower. More importantly, I've done nothing but work on a fantasy story for the past 3 years, and I sometimes feel like an idiot for caring so much about it. Watching Saitama do his thing gives me hope that what I do is still valid, even if I can't pay the bills with it. Anyway, that's it for me. Remember to check out my free book, Shotgun Fantasy. It's in the description and a pinned comment below. Thanks for watching.